in different business transactions and trade and the way that has impacted the world. I've also written biographies of some famous explorers such as George Vancouver, who, of course, created the first map of everything from California all the way through Alaska. One of my most fun projects was the biography of the famous Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen, the explorer of the South Pole and the North Pole, and all the controversies with Scott. And my various interests in all these interesting time periods and the people that lived in them always led me to with my interest in North American history, I was always focused on, how did we get here, and how did the political entities that we now live under become part of our modern day life? And when I went back to look at it, I realized there's one of the key things is this gigantic corporation, the Hudsons Bay Company. I mean, it was an enormous monopoly. It controlled 40% of the territory of the current country of Canada, as well as big chunks of North Dakota and Minnesota. And at one time, the 4 U.S. states, Idaho, Montana, Washington, and Oregon, that was all essentially under the control of this commercial monopoly. Yeah.
That is fascinating. So we're really looking forward to getting into this. I'm Lee Wright. I am the founder of History Camp. I'm near Boston. And with me in Virginia is...
Hi, I'm Carrie Lund. I'm the director of The Pursuit of History, the nonprofit that brings these History Camp discussions to you each week. We're glad you're here with us. Tonight we have our guest, Stephen Bown, who is an award-winning author. He has written 10 books on the history of exploration, science, and ideas. His books have been published in multiple English-speaking territories, translated into 9 languages, and shortlisted for many awards. Tonight, he's joining us to discuss his latest book, The Company, The Rise and Fall of the Hudsons Bay Empire. Thank you so much for joining us, Steve.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Well, Steve, I think many of the folks who are listening probably are familiar with Hudson Bay, maybe as a retail entity, but there's really a fascinating story here about the kind of opening up, as it were, of a large region of North America, and a model that we saw in other places, such as New Amsterdam and Jamestown and so forth. Set the stage for what was going on at the world at the time, and perhaps put this into context of some of those other corporate nation-state efforts.
Yeah, I mean, the 17th century. I mean, that was the age when countries in Europe were attempting to find a way to tap private capital to pursue their own national interests, their political interests across the seas. And you have your English East India Company, your Dutch West India Company, the Dutch East India Company. There was the Russian American Company, was around a similar time, moving across the Pacific to take over Alaska and rule it. I mean, and the whole idea of offering a monopoly to these entities was a way of guaranteeing that their private investment wouldn't be completely lost from domestic competitors just kind of moving in on the markets once they spent so much time creating them. And especially with an entity like the Hudsons Bay Company, which was created by Charles II and given a grandiose charter to some of his aristocratic cronies, they were hoping to sort of give the shaft to the French, who were establishing their countries and their empires along the St. Lawrence Seaway, and sort of finding a way around to the northern part of Hudson's Bay and into the coast, which of course was a trade route which would take them right into the heart of the continent. I mean, they could access river systems there that would control the entire Midwest of the continent. Not that they really knew what was in the Midwest of the continent. I mean, some maps at the time showed a giant inland sea occupying everything. And California has a little island on the coast and this magnificent ocean that was there. And they sometimes, thought maybe we'll get there and that'll be the ocean route to the Orient. We can get the spices and the pearls and the silk. And, there's a lot of delusions of extreme wealth that they imagined that they could achieve by having these, they just didn't. The geography was completely unknown, and it was astronomically expensive at that time. And that was what they were hoping to do with these monopolies, was provide a way that they could convince private investors to inject their own money into an economic entity that would benefit the host nation more than other nation. Like I was mentioning, the British especially wanted to get back at the French who were occupying the St. Lawrence Seaway area. And that's where the Hudsons Bay Company originally had its genesis.
So tell us more about how this particular entity came into being. This was for this one purpose. Is that correct?
I mean, it came into being because, they didn't know how to get there. And there were these two French fur traders who had been occupying, a central role in the history of New France, Radisson and Groseilliers. And they were always trying to push the fur trade west from the New France colony along the St. Lawrence, which at that time was only a few thousand people. So we're not talking about a large entity. And of course, there was a lot of fur trade happening with various Iroquois and Mohawk that was heading down the Hudson River towards the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, which later became New York. But these guys were focused more on the west, and they spent several years exploring the hinterland all the way along to the Great Lakes to the west of Lake Superior. And they came upon some remarkable discoveries. They realized when they were there that there were pre-existing trade networks that basically spread out across the entire continent, and almost anything could be obtained at these along the Mandan villages along the upper Missouri River. They were quite amazed to discover that you could, furs from the far north were obtainable there, as well as fish bones and shells and obsidian and fine leatherworks and, complicated artworks and beads and different types of food and dried herbs and spices and meats and almost anything you could obtain. And they were absolutely stunned that this existed, this central zone where everyone moved into. It was very vibrant and dynamic. And on their way home, they were led by some Cree adventurers, Cree being a northern, more forested people who lived to the south and west of Hudson's Bay, who were very much they were wanderers and hunters rather than sedentary corn farmers. Anyway, they were led up there and they discovered what they thought was a cabin where a fellow named Henry Hudson, a famous English mariner, was marooned in 1610, and he had overwintered a little bit and built this hut there. And they were stunned to see this, and they realized if English mariners had been there in 1610 and it's 1660 now, they could probably get there again and tap into these river systems, which would bring them right into the central heart of the continent, thereby bypassing everything that was happening in New France. Anyway, they went back to New France and they tried to tell the governor of this great discovery that they had. And the governor, it was a very closed economic system that they had in New France, where you couldn't really venture forth from the community without a permit, and you had to pay off all kinds of people. It was rent-seeking mercantilist type of entity. The governor didn't like it that they had left without seeking his permission and paying for the permit. So he confiscated all their furs and got in a complicated legal battle with them, which lasted years. Anyway, they lost a large fortune of their money, and they got really ticked off, and they set off down the Hudson River to New Amsterdam. And eventually they ended up in England and meeting with King Charles, and they were trying to present their idea to King Charles. The idea was, you're English. We know you English mariners have been there before. Why don't you let us guide you back there again? Our knowledge of indigenous cultures will help you get an inroad into this trading network. You can bypass the French and probably make a big pile of money and, screw over your hereditary enemy, the French, across the sea there. And King Charles bought it. And eventually he set up this charter, the Hudsons Bay Company, with this grandiose idea that it was going to have a monopoly over all trade and economic activity within the drainage basin of Hudson's Bay, which of course is a staggering region. It's 40% of the current country of Canada, and North Dakota and Minnesota and all. It was just enormous. They had no idea what it was since they had no map. But anyway, that was the genesis of the idea, and they set off and set up these forts along the rim of the bay then.
And give us a sense that the British, they'd launched other similar efforts, and so this was yet another kind of application of this model, correct? Saying we're going to give you a monopoly, and that's going to give you the potential to earn back money for the capital invested.
Yeah, I mean, the English East Company was operating under a similar model, from a generation earlier, and it was already, having some success in India, bringing spices back. But the English also looked and they saw the Dutch East India Company, though, and the Dutch East India Company was transforming the Dutch Republic into a little minor backwater into one of the great economic powerhouses of Europe at the time. And that was basically from having a monopoly on trade in the Indonesian spice era. They had already used this model by granting the monopoly, and the whole, well, actually it ties into the first early stock exchanges too. I mean, people were gambling on these voyages and buying the shares of these companies. And so, the whole nation was like behind their national champion monopoly companies that were setting off. I mean, the war with the Spanish and the war with the Portuguese that the Dutch were engaging in was being financed through commerce, really, which was a different model. It hadn't really been done before. Usually governments are involved in war and they try and extract some finances to pay for it with taxation. But this idea of tapping private capital to pursue national interests was somewhat new, and the English were just getting into that as well. And that's also exactly what the Hudsons Bay Company was too. I mean, they didn't know the potential for the trade, but they thought it could be enormous. There could be a way right through the spices of the Orient there, as well as the furs.
So the idea is presented. How much time elapses between the idea being presented and them ultimately coming to North America?
Not long. We're talking a handful of years here, which is very, very quick for the time, considering it was months of a voyage just to get across the ocean. It happened right away. King Charles II immediately knew that this was going to be a valuable thing, but he had to find some way to convince people to put up their own money to do this, because he didn't want to be involved in financing it through the state. He was on friendly terms with the King of France, friendly but competitive terms. These people are all members of large extended families, the aristocrats at the very top. So he couldn't just say, I'm going to finance through the English crown my own competitive entity that's going to go and circumvent the whole colonial economy of New France. That would be considered a very aggressive, hostile move. So this was a little bit, all he had to do was grant a monopoly, and he could just say, well, it's out of my hands. These are private people doing their own business. I don't have any control over them, and neither do you. That's what the model, that's where the genesis of these companies like the Hudsons Bay Company came from. It was very quick. 1670 was when the charter was granted, and they had already done a pre-voyage the year before to test if it was going to be viable, and it was successful enough. Very quickly, there were multiple different trading outposts along various river systems from James Bay to Hudson's Bay. Now, the company didn't know. I should point out, the company had no idea what was inland of that coastline. They didn't even have a map of the coastline, but the rough idea that they had of going along the coast, they did not know anything. It could have been a giant inland sea, as I was mentioning, that was there. And all they were doing was setting up these like rudimentary, primitive wooden stockade forts along key river systems, stocking them with merchandise that was brought over from England, which was manufacturing center at the time. And according to the, Radisson's and Groseillier's business plan they were good at identifying which items would be most valuable to people into trade, and they wanted to get some furs, and the best furs at the time were, of course, northern furs. The animals in the winter put on luxurious, thick, rich coats. And all those pelts of all those beavers were taken back to England, and using a mercury compound, which, of course, drove the people mad, so they had mercury poisoning and went insane. But nevertheless, before they went insane, they were earning quite a good living making felt out of furs. And the felt was, of course, also used had some military applications, but the main commercial use and the most money was from taking this felt and turning it into those extravagant, beautiful hats that were so famous for several hundred years. The black stovetop hats, or the fancy, elaborate women's hats, because they had properties that kept them waterproof and warm, and they held their shape, and they could change according to the fashions of the time because the felt could be manipulated. Extremely valuable products. And when they went over there to do this trade along the coast, the people were giving off these beavers, and they were joking, saying at one time it was ridiculous the amount of money, that the material value that some of these indigenous cultures were getting in exchange for what to them was a cast-off beaver pelt was astronomical. They thought these people were fools. They're giving us daggers and knives or gunpowders or guns or any other metal tools, because metal was the one thing that was missing amongst the menu of goods that was generally available to those people. Anything metal, and they thought, what? This is extremely valuable to us, and all we have to do is give you this ridiculous old pelt. And at the time, the most valuable pelt was one that had been worn by someone for a year already, because there's the way that the beavers have their fur is that there's an inner fur and there's an outer fur, and the outer fur is very coarse and hard, and it's very warm, but it's not what you want for making felt. And so if someone had taken a clothing, for example, and they wore it all winter long, and it was all sweaty and dirty and everything, and they were about to get rid of it, by rubbing on their body all year, it had already worn off the outer furs, the fur strands, and therefore it was far more valuable to the trader. So I was jokingly calling it the used fur trade. They were, buying up used clothes. It was the used clothing trade. They were buying up used clothing from people, and these people were laughing, saying, "I'm throwing out, I was about to throw out this coat, and you're giving me a whole knife for it." I mean, so it was a very interesting dynamic that was going on there in these early days.
That's fascinating. So, just give us some context. Roughly, how many people were backing this entity? Roughly, how many people came over as part of it in this first wave?
It was very small at the beginning. It was not a massive national entity like the English East India Company, which was huge, or even the Dutch West India Company. Was a large entity controlling big chunks of, the Hudson River and New York. This was fairly small. There was only a few dozen politically well-connected, wealthy financiers and aristocrats who were backing the whole thing. And there was only, for most of the 18th century, there's really only up to 500 people directly employed by the company. Now, of course, one of the things I'd like to point out, that I pointed out in my book, is that it's not just that those employees were there. There's 500. Those people, when they came over, owing to the nature of the geography and the difficulty of getting there, they all had Indigenous wives. Because you can imagine the distance between London and Western Hudsons Bay, if you want to bring up a map, is enormous, thousands and thousands of miles. I mean, these ships at the time were made of wood, just oak trees chopped down, hammered into these rudimentary ships without any power at all, power all by sail on cloth. It takes them months across the ocean, with diseases and scurvy ravaging the crew, and occasionally these ships would get caught in a storm, or they would hit an iceberg and they would sink. I mean, it was extremely dangerous. And to wend your way up through Hudson's Bay was even more dangerous, because you could, well, it was very treacherous sailing waters, and there's icebergs there. And then they get onto the shore, and it's this wind-lashed, stony, blasted plain with hardly any trees for any distance around you, and it's nearly impossible to actually survive there. And the Indigenous people wouldn't have lived there all year round either, because, well, for the obvious reason that it's not a very nice place to live. So owing to that, the employees, when the company brought them over, they often signed 7-year contracts. So they did not just return home at the end of the season. They went and lived there for 7 years minimum. Many of them stayed their whole lives there. So they also had families. So they had Indigenous wives, and they had Indigenous mixed heritage children who learned the language and they learned the customs. I mean, it's probably not inaccurate to say that the success of the Hudsons Bay Company in getting inroads into this trade was as much a cultural enterprise as it was a business enterprise. I mean, with diplomatic marriages and ceremonial exchange, they were more like treaties or negotiated agreements between different groups of people with mutual obligations to each other to look after each other, and to it wasn't just a trade between anonymous people. They knew each other. They had long-term relationships with them over many years. So yes, there was only 500 people, but if you count all their wives and you count all their children and you count the other people who were doing hunting for them and the people who were guiding for them, it's a lot more. And the whole retail aspect of the trade, let's call it, was being managed by Indigenous business enterprises. I mean, that's not normally the way that we like to think about it. However, the Hudsons Bay Company had a bunch of wooden outposts along the coast, How were all these thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of prime furs and other items finding their way to the coast? It wasn't them. They had never ventured inland, and they didn't for 100 years. There was large trading conglomerates being run by various, it was primarily the Cree who were involved in that, who set off on multi-year journeys into the interior of the continent, buying up the furs of other people and transporting them to the bay themselves. So the retail trade was also being run by someone. So I don't, what do you call an employee of a company like that when there's all these, it expands out. It's like saying a real estate agent isn't really an employee because they're a contractor.
You sort of at the Cree is very interesting. I think generally we have this conceit that present day people so smart, right? And long ago, naive and knowledgeable and skilled. And unsurprisingly, you would have in any society, right, individuals who've got a certain skill set, realizing, wait a minute, there's certain efficiencies, right, certain ways we could set this up, and them emerging with a much more sophisticated trading system than maybe one kind of naively thinks of like going into a camp and trading a couple of furs. So that's a really helpful perspective. How many settlements were there, and over what time period were those built?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question, because I covered 200 years of the company's existence. It lost its monopoly after 200 years, and so that was a good time to end the story. So over 200 years, there's a lot of change over time, and that's one thing that I think is lost. Sometimes people don't, these days, I find they don't have a very good appreciation for certain things in a historical perspective. That stuff is always changing. Everything's changing into our life. I mean, look, a few years ago, no one had cell phones. Now we can hardly imagine how our life could live without them. That's the same in the past. Things came, things went. There was always change over time. So it's not that everything is not, static just because it happened hundreds of years ago. The perception of the world changed over time too. And so they only began with one fort, but they quickly expanded it to multiple forts. At one time, there was probably 6 along Hudson's Bay. And then later in the century, of course, there was, as I was just mentioning, the retail aspect of the trade was being managed by others. And the company, in 1753, I believe, they finally sent someone inland to go and see what was going on. And, there's a person named Anthony Henday. And if you go on Wikipedia, you can see, Anthony Henday, and it'll bring up a map showing Anthony Henday's great explorers, and it'll show a little dotted line where he went and everything. But Anthony Henday didn't go anywhere. Someone took him. There was a fellow named Atikashish, who was one of the Cree trading captains, who said, "Well, you can come with me. I'm heading off." And he took Henday on his 2-year business circuit, which was within sight of the Rocky Mountains. Anthony Henday saw them conducting business along the river systems, prearranged locations where people would meet them and they would do their exchange. And this fellow and many, many others were essentially using the company's outposts on Hudson's Bay as wholesale distribution centers while managing the retail aspect of it themselves. And so that was the company first started to realize the full extent of what was transpiring inland from where they operated was not until the mid-18th century. They realized, actually, there's this huge trade network, and it's almost going all the way down to Mexico. By the time they got out to the plains, they were encountering, trained equestrians who were riding horses around hunting buffaloes, and it was like, whoa, this is a very different thing. And at first, they didn't even believe him that was the case. They said, "There's no way, that we don't believe you." It's interesting how the world was revealed to them, just as the world was being revealed to the indigenous peoples who occupied the inland parts of the continent at the same time. There's a cultural exchange, and a geographic knowledge was increasing, as well as the increasing interdependence of those two groups of people and societies.
Were there examples of indigenous individuals moving into the Hudson Bay Company?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, right from the very beginning, like I mentioned, they all had indigenous wives who were, because a lot of them spent most of their life there. Some of them didn't even retire back to England. They just continued to live there. Their children grew up with a foot in both worlds. And so some of these children were completely fluent in English, but they were also fluent in Cree or other languages too in different areas where the company was operated. And those people were ideally suited for that business. And, some of them ended up working on the ships back and forth to England. Some of them even ended up in England or being sent back for education, and then they came back. Some tended more towards their mother's side of the family. But after a very short period of time, a lot of those people were forming the key employees of the company as it expanded, so that, we call them the Métis or the country born or the mixed heritage. I mean, there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who are alive right now whose ancestors are directly related to that, whether they even know it. I'm not talking about the ones who have that specific identity and who grew up with that. I'm just talking about the many, many multitudes of people who came from both sides of this exchange.
So the book covers the 200 years. Give us a sense of that evolution of the company as North America and the world was also changing.
Yeah, I mean, as population centers were increasing in the eastern part of the continent, larger, more European-focused population centers, there was a marked decrease in the population of large numbers of the indigenous, groupings, nations, peoples, whoever we want to call them. There was one particularly vicious smallpox epidemic around 1780 that came up from Mexico, and it was able to transfer so quickly because people had taken to horses and they were riding quicker, and so asymptomatic people were traveling between communities and passing on this disease without anyone even knowing it. And that went all the way up the entire western part of the continent, from Mexico all the way up the Rocky Mountains, and then it went east across until the Hudson's Bay. And it was so devastating that it was actually killing up to 80% of the people in certain regions. And, it's an interesting thing to think about during these current pandemic, time period. Think of the fear and economic disruption that has been caused by this pandemic now, and imagine something that's like 1,000-fold more deadly, partly because at the time they had absolutely no idea what was the cause of any of these diseases, or what, if anything, you could do to affect any kind of cure of it. And the residual damage that came, the collateral damage when, the children would die because their parents were taken out. And so if there had been someone to take care of them, they may have, some might recover, but by then there's nowhere to look after them. And then the children are dying. Like the disruption, the social disruption, the economic disruption that was caused by that was absolutely enormous. And that completely, transformed the economy of the Midwestern part of the entire continent by depopulating, whole regions, and the cultural destruction that came along with that, and the loss of community between peoples. I mean, the immediate thing was, well, imagine that, even in the context of the Hudson's Bay Company, to the directors in London or the financiers or the people on the ships over there, they might have viewed that as a looming labor shortage, or there's going to be a shortage of furs in the next couple of years. I mean, to the people who lived there, whose families were there, who were fully integrated into what was happening, that was a devastating blow. It was an entirely different thing altogether. But after several years of that sent the company on a completely different path. So their business model that had existed for a century, that's a long time for a business. I mean, how many businesses are around even now how many are around now that were even in the 60s? I mean, think of how rapid things change. I mean, this was after a century of a single business model, a pretty successful business model. They had to venture inland themselves because there was no longer the social infrastructure for large-scale domestic, transfer businesses and trading businesses. And so the company itself started moving inland, south and west from that Hudson's Bay, setting up their own posts along the river systems all the way across the continent. And of course, by the 19th century, they had gone over the Rocky Mountains. They had followed the Columbia River down, large Columbia River, which actually begins in the mountains of British Columbia in Canada. It flows north for quite a while before making a hairpin turn, zooming south down the central part of that province, and then cutting into Idaho and running along the Washington-Oregon border before it reaches the Pacific Ocean. The Hudson's Bay Company ended up taking over the Columbia River system as its main artery of trade in the West. And so they had supply lines that essentially crossed the entire continent from Hudson's Bay to the Pacific Ocean at that point by the 1820s. So, that is a rapid expansion of a business during that time. And eventually there were no competitors to it. So it was really quite a powerful entity. It started to have more control over Indigenous peoples because so many of them had been destroyed by disease, as well as more control over its employees because it was so huge and there was really nowhere else for anyone to go. And in fact, there's geopolitical implications of that too. I mean, the company was there operating, and it wasn't directly linked to the British government at this time, but it was being forced to take on roles that furthered the British Empire as payoff to keep its monopoly. And one of the things they were trying to do, because the American Empire, at that time, let's call it that, because it hadn't expanded across the continent yet, was moving west as well, along with the population increase. But there was no border between these areas. All of that region had formerly just been completely owned by the people who lived there before any Europeans arrived, and no one ever thought of taking it over. But, politics as they are, these tectonic entities were struggling over who's going to control what. And of course, there's a Spanish Empire was also coming up and owned California, what's California now, and other states that were near there. And there's the Russian Empire was coming down from Alaska, and there's this gigantic no man's land that they called Old Oregon. And it encompassed basically, Idaho, Montana, Washington, Oregon, Northern California, all of British Columbia. That was a struggle point. And so in order to keep its monopoly, the Hudson's Bay Company was ordered to do something to stop these American trappers. They're coming across the mountains. And so this one of the famous governors of the company, who was not a very nice person, but he was a very astute and strategic thinker, George Simpson, said, well, we're going to send out brigades of people along the Snake River in Idaho and southern Idaho region. And we're going to exterminate all the beavers that we can along the rivers. And so he sent out brigades of dozens and dozens of people to just go there and hunt that region dry and just go and murder the beavers, kill them all they could. And their main objective was, if we go and kill everything that's in that region, then when the Americans are coming over the mountains, they'll find that this region is not worth going into. And then our region, which is further west in Oregon and Washington, will be preserved for our own monopoly interests for a longer period of time. And so, that's the kind of thing that was going on at this area. Very fascinating, right? And it did affect, the location and placement of international borders.
Fascinating. And so the at the end of the 200-year monopoly, what finally brought that to an end? And what is the Hudson's Bay Company today? And we'll go through that, and then I think we'll see what questions we have from others.
Sure. I mean, its end was a bit anticlimactic, let's just say. But in the 1840s, I mean, it started to the rumor that. Let's begin. There was a fellow named Dr. John McLaughlin, who was a descendant of a medical doctor in New France, in Montreal, and he was one of the key Hudson's Bay Company senior managers. And he had been sent over, and he was managing everything on the Columbia River. And he set up this place that he called Fort Vancouver. It was a politically named place because Vancouver was an English mariner who was in the 1790s making his map of the coastline and that calling this fort, which is near Portland, Oregon now, Fort Vancouver, was their way of trying to say, yes, look, there had been British people here even earlier than this, as a political like a dog peeing on a tree, right?
Yeah.
And this fort grew into a settlement, which is not what the Hudsons Bay Company wanted. But Dr. John McLaughlin, who's now is actually called the father of Oregon, he very much wanted a settlement. He wanted fruit groves, and he wanted agriculture, and he wanted trade with all the different peoples that were around. And it was a very fluid, open-minded, multicultural center with all the different. He even had Japanese shipwrecked sailors that were there. He welcomed British, he welcomed his American travelers, he welcomed the Hudson's Bay people. All the different indigenous tribes were all part of this little community that he was building. And word of this got out, and there was various stock market crashes in the 1830s in the eastern part of the U.S., and that's what ended up causing this migration on the Oregon Trail, and thousands and thousands of those famous the chuck wagons with the little cloth bag covering over them. That was all 1830s, and the end of the Oregon Trail was Fort Vancouver. The Hudson's Bay Company outpost was the only commercial operation in the entire region. But so many thousands of these people went there, and McLaughlin was giving them credit at the company store, even though he was being criticized for it. But he said, well, I'm not going to have those people come out here and starve to death. Of course, I'm giving them food when they arrive. So he really helped the foundation of that community to further develop. But that ended up being, there were so many American people who identified as American citizens there that eventually a person died and didn't have a will and had an estate with 600 cattle and they said, well, we need a set of laws to figure out what to do with this. And Dr. John McLaughlin of the Hudson's Bay Company, well, it's not me. I'm a trader. I work for a company. I'm not associated with any country. It's not me. And so they declared that they were going to be part of the United States. And then there was the International Border Agreement that came after that, which just said, well, yes, it's going to go along the 49th parallel then. And so the company moved its operations up to Fort Victoria on the southern tip of Vancouver Island, and Fort Vancouver transformed into something else over time. And the company had lost its monopoly because, well, eventually the British government got rid of its monopoly. It was becoming anachronistic, and the border had already cut off a big chunk of its most profitable region at the time, which was, the Pacific Northwest of the United States. And it was operating in British Columbia, but that wasn't quite as popular, and there was a declining interest in furs, so it kind of petered out, and it eventually got into land speculation and other commercial aspects, like after the fact. But it lost its monopoly, and it was no longer a giant political powerhouse that it was, and it started to get into land speculation along railroads. But that's a different story, and it was not the same business ever after that. So
this is fascinating. I think we have lots of people who join us who have a lot of familiarity with the history of the East Coast and New England and so forth. And so it's so interesting to learn more as we think about all the things that were going on in other parts of North America. Great visual image of the trading that was taking place up and down along the rivers rather. Let's see if Carrie will join us and talk to us about questions that we may have gotten from people watching.
Hello. All right. Jane would like to know about competition with, and then the later merging with Northwest Fur Company. Can you tell us a little about that?
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's a fantastic story too. Of course, that's the monopolies competing against each other, which is always kind of a fun thing. The Northwest Company was the combination of all the disparate elements of the French trade that still existed. There was the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, depending on what you want to call it, which ended up eventually with the British conquering New France in 1763. But the years of war leading up to that were very disruptive, and the French had mostly retreated from the trade completely. And then when the British conquered New France, there was no reason for the French to be obeying any monopoly because it didn't exist anymore. But then all those traders suddenly had access to the capital markets of London, and a bunch of Scottish entrepreneurs went there, and with their knowledge of how to access capital and their knowledge of talking to the French voyageurs, said, well, we can put together a new business enterprise here and we'll start competing. And they began to do that, and monopolies were out of favor. And so technically the company still had a charter, but they didn't want to push it too far, and they didn't want to cause any conflict and draw too much attention to it. So the Northwest Company was able to expand its operations west of Hudson's Bay and into the Ohio River Valley up until 1796. And they ended up being enormously competitive to the Hudson's Bay Company. Eventually, they were 4 times the size of the Hudson's Bay Company, and most of the profits were going to them. They had a very dynamic and entrepreneurial profit-sharing structure, as opposed to sort of a bureaucratic, planned, centrally organized, stead entity, which was like the Northwest Company. And these two corporate cultures were completely different. And the Northwest Company was basically eating the lunch of the Hudson's Bay Company. And they actually went to war. They were fighting each other. Like, it became an actual war, not just a commercial war, but they were shooting at each other's people and capturing their brigades and destroying each other's ships and bombarding the forts and murdering each other's employees. And that went on for several years before the British government said, whoa, this is a real problem. We can't have that. And of course, there was no overarching law in those regions. So who were they going to apply to? Eventually, the British government forced the two companies together, merged them together, and called them the Hudson's Bay Company. So it got rid of the Northwest Company name altogether. And that's when the British government started to take, that was in 1820, and that's when they started to take a greater controlling interest in the company and tried to tie it more closely to British imperial objectives.
Okay, thank you. All right, we have a viewer asking about, I'm going to probably say this name wrong, Gillis van Hoornbeek, who was, looks like a Dutch trader. He was in the 1600s, part of the Amsterdam Chamber who ordered trading ships. Did you come across him in your research for this?
I have heard of that name before. It's not something that I cover specifically in this book, and that probably would have been more with the Dutch East India Company, which, I mean, that's a fascinating story too, of course. I mean, how the dried plant matter from Indonesia could be worth its weight in gold by the time it got back to Europe. That's why commerce is so fascinating, what the different values that people attribute to different things at different times and what comes in and out of fashion. It's a fascinating time.
Definitely. All right, I am going to make sure everybody has seen your book cover, and we have a link to the book in the chat, so you'll want to make sure you take a look at that and check that out. And thank you so much, Steve. This has been really interesting, and like I said, like Lee had mentioned earlier, it was kind of fun to go out west a little bit. We spend a lot of time on the East Coast, it seems like, so it's good to venture out a bit. So thank you very much.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So next week, February 4th, we will be talking with Linda Jeffers Coombs. She is an elder of the Wampanoag people, and she's an author and historian, and she will be discussing the Wampanoag's experience with the Pilgrims' arrival, as well as the effects of an epidemic that swept through the land shortly before the Pilgrims arrived. So we are looking forward to that. And we would also like to thank the James and Edith Spain Foundation for their support. They are what helps us bring these discussions to you each week. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Have a good night.
Thank you.